Welcome to our deep dive today.
Hey.
I have to say this one's really tough. We're going to be looking at the recent mass shooting in Sweden.
Oh, yeah.
And it's an event that has just shocked a nation that's really known for peacefulness.
Yeah.
So the shooting happened at a school
Wow.
in Arboga.
Okay.
And it's a seemingly quiet town, about 125 miles west of Stockholm.
Mm-hmm.
It was lunchtime, a normal day, and it just chaos erupts.
Yeah.
And what makes this so unsettling, I think, for a lot of us is that it challenges everything we think we know about Sweden.
It really does. I think it's particularly jarring because Sweden actually has one of the highest rates of gun crime in the entire EU.
Really?
But there's a crucial distinction here.
Okay.
That high rate is very much attributed to gang violence.
Yeah.
Almost a world apart from everyday life for Swedes.
Yeah.
So this attack targeting innocent civilians at a school seemingly at random is a whole different story.
Right. Yeah. And it wasn't gang-related.
Mm-hmm.
And what gets me is the location.
Yeah.
This wasn't some big city school. This was a place where you'd think everyone would feel safe.
Exactly. And to add to that, the building itself housed both a college for adult learners and schools for children. So you can imagine the absolute terror of parents frantically trying to reach their kids, not knowing if they were in the line of fire.
And eyewitness accounts are just chilling. We have some of those in front of us, and they're just hard to read.
Oh, I bet.
One student described seeing people shot right next to him bleeding on the floor. Another talked about texting with her terrified mother for over 2 hours while hiding under a desk during the lockdown.
Oh, gosh. It's just hard to comprehend that level of fear and uncertainty.
Right.
This event has ripped apart the sense of safety that Sweden has always prided itself on. It raises so many questions about how a society, especially one known for its social cohesion, can even begin to process a tragedy like this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
While the investigation is ongoing, we know the basic facts. 10 people were killed, including the shooter, a 35-year-old male with no known connections to the school.
Wow.
The police said he acted alone, and he wasn't on their radar before this. They're searching his apartment, trying to piece together any clues about his motive.
And even as they search for those answers, the Prime Minister has called it brutal, deadly violence against totally innocent people. The nation is really in mourning, grappling with this shocking event that seems to have come out of nowhere.
It's like this tragedy has forced Sweden to confront a dark side it never wanted to believe it had.
Yeah.
It's one thing to read statistics about gang violence, but to see this kind of senseless attack, that's a whole different reality.
What's especially fascinating, though, is how this tragedy kind of intersects with Sweden's image as a peaceful and equitable nation. We have to ask ourselves, how can a country known for its social safety net and progressive values also have such a high rate of gun violence, even if it's primarily within gang activity?
Yeah, it feels like a real contradiction.
Yeah.
On one hand, you have Sweden with this reputation for being this peaceful, egalitarian society. But on the other hand, you have this undercurrent of violence.
Right.
What's the missing piece of the puzzle here?
That's a really complex question, and I don't think there's a single easy answer. But I think what is clear is this event has ignited a national debate about those very issues.
Okay.
It's forcing people to confront some pretty uncomfortable truths.
Yeah, and it's not just a theoretical debate anymore, is it? This tragedy has brought it home for so many Swedes.
Exactly. It's no longer a problem that's happening over there in some marginalized community. It's shattered the sense of security for everyday citizens, for parents who send their kids to school, for anyone who thought they were immune to this kind of violence.
One journalist we were looking at actually used to teach in Arboga, and he described the national mood as being on edge.
Wow.
He said everyone from ordinary people to politicians is deeply affected by this, trying to figure out how to prevent it from happening again.
I bet. And that sense of urgency is palpable. And it's interesting to see how Sweden is channeling that anxiety. One of the immediate responses was the establishment of these conflict centers throughout the country.
I was struck by that too. Could you maybe explain what those are for our listeners? The term itself might not be familiar to everyone.
Sure. Conflict centers are basically safe spaces where people can go to process the trauma. They get emotional support and talk about what they're going through. It's a very proactive approach, acknowledging that a tragedy like this has ripple effects that extend far beyond just the immediate victims.
So it's not just about dealing with the aftermath, but also about preventing further harm.
Exactly. It's a way of recognizing the psychological impact of this kind of event, and then providing the resources to help people cope and heal. It also speaks to that deeply ingrained sense of community and social responsibility in Sweden.
Right. Even in their grief and their shock, they're coming together, looking out for one another. It's almost like they're trying to reaffirm those values of peace and unity that this event threatened.
Yeah, and that's where the real work begins. How do you move forward after something like this? How do you address the root causes of violence, not just the symptoms? How do you prevent it from happening again?
We saw some discussion in the articles about potential solutions.
Uh-huh.
There were calls for stricter gun laws, better mental health resources, a reassessment of security measures in schools.
Yeah, none of those are simple fixes. There are really complex issues tied into each of those areas. Political debates about gun control, societal stigma surrounding mental health, resource allocation for school safety.
Right, and it's easy to get bogged down in those complexities, to feel overwhelmed by the scale of the problem. But it seems like there's a real determination in Sweden to actually grapple with these questions and find a way forward.
Absolutely. And that's what's so fascinating to me about this whole situation. How does a nation so deeply shaken by this tragedy find the strength and resilience to not only mourn, but also to learn and to grow?
And maybe even to come out stronger on the other side.
Perhaps this event has exposed some really deep fault lines in Swedish society, but it's also highlighted their capacity for compassion, their commitment to community, and their willingness to confront difficult issues head on.
You know, it's interesting because one expert we read suggested this tragedy might actually become a catalyst for positive change.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's forcing Sweden to have these difficult conversations about gun control schools, safety, mental health issues that might have been swept under the rug before.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. Sometimes it takes a shocking event to really shake things up, to make people confront those issues they'd rather avoid.
And those conversations are already starting to happen. We're seeing these calls for stricter gun laws, more investment in mental health resources, a complete overhaul of security in schools.
Of course, these conversations are never easy. There are always going to be different viewpoints, different priorities, especially when you're talking about something as sensitive as gun control in a country that values individual freedom. But what matters is that the dialogue is happening, that people are engaged and actively searching for solutions.
It feels like Sweden is at a crossroads. This tragedy has exposed vulnerabilities, but it's also ignited this determination to learn from it, prevent future tragedies.
It is, and that's the key takeaway here, I think. It's not about dwelling on the darkness or assigning blame, but about channeling that collective grief and anger into something constructive.
It's a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable loss, there's always hope. There's always the possibility of growth, of learning, of building a better future.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that this isn't just a Swedish story. We've seen similar tragedies in countries all over the world.
Right.
The questions that Sweden is grappling with are questions we all need to be asking ourselves.
How do we create safer communities? How do we address the root causes of this violence, not just the symptoms? How do we build a world where tragedies like this become unthinkable?
Those are the questions that linger long after the headlines fade. And they're questions we all have a responsibility to engage with, no matter where we live.
So where do we go from here? It's up to each of us to reflect on what we've learned from this deep dive, to consider how we can contribute to positive change, and hold on to hope even in the darkest of times.
I think that's a really powerful message to end on. Thank you for joining us on this difficult but important journey. We hope this deep dive has provided some valuable insights and food for thought.